Okay, video 17, abdominal muscles. Let's see. So there are 4 muscles in this group that we call the abdominals. And rectus abdominis is one. This is the one we're looking at here. So let's name these 4, and we're not actually going to go through them in the order that they are in the handout because they don't pop up like that in the app. So anyway, let me put these on here. There they are. Okay, so the 4 muscles of the abdominal group are rectus abdominis, external abdominal oblique, internal abdominal oblique, and transversus abdominis. So these 4 muscles are interesting muscles. So one thing that all of them except for rectus abdominis have in common is they all participate in this fascia here that becomes what we call the rectus sheath. So here we're looking at here we're looking at the external obliques, which I have to say I don't totally love the way that they show the external obliques on the app because I don't like the angle of the fibers the way they show it, but I didn't make the app, so there we go. Anyway, so the yellow part here, this is all what I was just talking about, the rectus sheath. It is the tendon of this muscle. The abdominal muscles all feed into and create what's called the abdominal aponeurosis. And let's see. And then there's also this line here in the middle, in the middle here, that is important in the abdominals right here. This is the linea alba. The linea alba, that name means white line. Linea means line and alba means white. And we'll see a number of these muscles are kind of using that as this attachment point. So that is this connective tissue that runs from the xiphoid process of the sternum up here to the pubic bone down here. That's the linea alba. Okay, but back to the rectus sheath. So here we're looking at the external obliques. Let's take off a layer, and here we're looking at the internal obliques, but here we can still see, this fascia here that is the tendon of the internal obliques. And if we take off another layer, we'll be looking at, let's do one more layer off. Now we're looking at transversus abdominis, which is the deepest of them, but we still see this, right? This fascia. So those 3 of the erectors, transversus abdominis, which is the deepest of them, the internal obliques, which is just superficial to transversus abdominis, and the external obliques, which is the most superficial of those 3 abdominal muscles, their tendons all come together to form this thing here that we call the rectus sheath. And then the muscle rectus abdominis exists inside that sheath. So if we look at rectus abdominis, the transversus abdominis is posterior to it. So let's take it away again. So there's transversus abdominis. It's the deepest, and you can see its tendon there. Its tendinous part here that's tying into the linea alba. And so now let's put rectus abdominis on, and then let's put another layer on, and what we'll see is rectus abdominis gets encased inside that rectus sheath. So that's kind of an interesting thing about the erectors, about how they're set up. So the erectors as a group, so as these 4 muscles that make up this group, they have this interesting job, okay? Because so in the back we have bony structure all the way along the back. In the front, we don't have bony structure between the rib cage and the pelvis, and we have a bunch of internal organs in there. So the body has this trade-off that it needs to make between mobility and protection. So if we wanted to really, really protect those internal organs, we could be like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and have a shell on our front. Which, you know, in essence, we could say kind of our rib cage serves that purpose, right? For the internal organs that are in, you know, that are inside the rib cage. So the heart and the lungs, they are protected by the rib cage. But the internal organs that are in the abdominal region, here, there's no rib cage over them. And so the trade-off is, if we want to have mobility, we can't have bony structure all the way down. So that means that the, let's get rid of the digestive system. So that means that these muscles, these guys, the abdominal muscles, part of their job has to be a bit of a protector of those internal organs, so that we can maintain mobility, so that the rib cage and the pelvis can move separately from each other. But also, if these muscles all contract together, we can move the rib cage and the pelvis as a unit. So we can make the torso a whole unit that moves together. So that's kind of big picture job of the abdominal muscles, is they provide protection. So it's this layer of 4 thick, strong muscles. They provide mobility so that we can move between the rib cage and the pelvis. But if these guys all contract, they create lots of stability so that we can move the torso as a unit. So lots going on here with the abdominals. And also kind of, as you know, speaking to the protection function that they serve, we're going to see fibers going in every direction, which allows, again, for protection, so that we can contract from every direction and make a firm protection of our internal organs. But also, we can move in any direction. We can twist, we can side bend, we can flex, and there's mobility where we can extend there too. But these guys aren't doing extension. They're all on the anterior side of the body, so they're doing flexion and other similar, you know, flexion and side bending. All right, so let's start going through these guys one by one. This first one is external abdominal oblique. It is the most superficial of the abdominal muscles. Now, I mentioned I didn't completely love how the app shows the external obliques, because what I would prefer is to show these fibers going a little more in this direction, like that, okay? And in your book, that is what we see, and even where we have something, you know, like that on the side, where it's almost straight up and down. So if you look at the diagram in the book, that's what you'll see is more angled fibers like this. You know, the way that they show it here in the app looks more like transversus abdominis, whose fibers do go in a transverse direction. External obliques, the fibers go in an oblique direction. That's why it's called the external obliques. They are the most superficial. That's why they're called external. They're in the abdominal region. That's why they're called abdominal. External abdominal obliques. So now, where do these muscles attach? This is the weirdo thing about the abdominals. So we think of abdominals as being anterior muscles, but they really do wrap all the way around the torso. So see the abdominals back here? So look, here's latissimus dorsi. Let's get rid of that guy. Oops, I added muscles. Let's get rid of him. And now we can see oops, these are the internal obliques. But we can see the abdominals wrapping all the way around. They're like a, what we see right here, right in through here, that's transversus abdominis, and what we see right here is the internal obliques. But they wrap all the way around, and they're super supportive to the lumbar region. This is like, you know, if somebody has weak abdominals and they need to do some lifting, what do? They put on a lumbar belt that supports their low back. If their abdominals were not weak, they would not need to put on a lumbar belt. All right, so where are we here? External obliques. So, attachments on the external obliques. So they attach at the anterior iliac crest. So that is here. Okay, that's easy enough to see. Anterior iliac crest, the pubic bone here, and the abdominal aponeurosis. And so the abdominal aponeurosis is this, what I was calling the rectus sheath. So this this thing that is created by all of the abdominals. That's part of the attachment here for the external obliques. Okay, so basically they kind of have this lower sort of area attachment in through here as far as their origin, which is not to say that they don't go all the way up, because as you can see, they totally go all the way up. Okay, but then they attach down and through there. And then their upper attachment is the lower 8 ribs. So in through here, that's their lower attachment is the lower, their upper attachment, is the lower 8 ribs. So then what does that mean? What actions do we see from the external obliques? So all of the abdominal muscles, with the exception of transversus abdominis, they all do flexion of the trunk. And so that's one sort of group action we can keep in mind with the abdominals, is flexion of the trunk. And flexion of the trunk, that's what you do if you're doing sit-ups. Like you're like, I want to work my abs, so you do sit-ups. You're doing trunk flexion when you're doing that. So flexion of the trunk, easy enough to remember. And again, the way they have it drawn on the ab, not easy to imagine, but if they had these fibers drawn like this, we could see that this muscle would participate in flexion, because if we pull down on these ribs, the ribs are going to get closer to the attachments down here, and we're going to have a flexion action happening. So flexion of the trunk is one action of the external obliques. A posterior pelvic tilt is another action of the external oblique. So a posterior pelvic tilt, remember when we were talking about the erector spinae group, we were talking about an anterior pelvic tilt. So now we're talking about a posterior pelvic tilt. So a posterior pelvic tilt is when the anterior superior iliac spine moves posteriorly. And so a posterior pelvic tilt is it creates a flattening of the lumbar spine, and it's essentially the action, like say you're laying down, and instead of doing sit-ups or crunching up, you're keeping your back down and you're lifting your pelvis up toward the rib cage. That would be a posterior pelvic tilt. So it's actually the reverse mover action of the erectors. If their standard mover action is flexion of the trunk, the reverse mover action is posterior pelvic tilt. So it's just moving the more of the pelvic end of the muscle. Another action for the external obliques is lateral flexion of the trunk. So again, I have this issue with how this is drawn because we don't see any fibers going in this direction, but they do. The fibers go in this direction, and so we can get lateral flexion of the trunk. So you can imagine if fibers were going in that direction, that we could pull down on the rib cage and bring the rib cage closer to the pelvis, and we would get a lateral flexion. And then the other action of the external obliques is a contralateral rotation of the pelvis. So contralateral rotation means that if the left side of the external obliques is contracting, is going to pull the body around to face the right. That's a contralateral rotation. Okay, all of the abdominal muscles do compression of the abdomen, and transversus abdominis, that's all it does, but all the rest of them do participate in it also. They all help out with compression of the abdomen. Okay, so those are actions and attachments of the external obliques. Let's see what's next. Let's take off a layer and take a look at the internal obliques. All right, internal obliques. So these, you can see the fiber direction drawn better on the internal obliques. Internal obliques are the middle layer between the external obliques and the and transversus abdominis. The internal obliques, let's look at attachments for these guys. So they attach to the inguinal ligament. Let me introduce the inguinal ligament. Connective tissue. There's the inguinal ligament. So the inguinal ligament is right here. It runs from the anterior superior iliac spine to the pubic bone. So it kind of fills in some connective tissue space there, and we'll notice that we have some muscles that run under it, so in through here, like iliacus and psoas. These are muscles that do hip flexion, that run under it, but the abdominals attach to it somewhat. So that is the internal obliques, part of their attachment is the inguinal ligament. So inguinal, you remember that term, inguinal? The inguinal region is that line essentially between the abdomen and the thigh. That's the inguinal region. All right, so the internal obliques, they attach at the inguinal ligament here. They attach to the iliac crest here. And the thoracolumbar fascia. What the heck is that? Boom, boom, there it is. Well, kind of. We don't see it so well, but let's just pretend we do. In through here, thoracolumbar fascia. So I can't remember right now if I mentioned this. There you can see it nicely when we see the name of this muscle is latissimus dorsi. Latissimus was escaping me. When we look at latissimus dorsi, we can nicely see this thoracolumbar fascia. It is this really strong, dense connective tissue that a lot of muscles tie into. So it essentially is this collection of the tendon aspect of many different muscles that, again, is this major low back support. Latissimus dorsi is part of it. Deeper muscles also are part of it, but the abdominal muscles are definitely part of it. And so here, what we see right here is transversus abdominis, and so you can kind of get a sense that the fibers of it are going to come, like this and tie into that thoracolumbar fascia. Okay, so those were our attachments for the internal obliques: the inguinal ligament, the iliac crest, and the thoracolumbar fascia. So essentially, we're kind of going around like this for attachments, and then into the back here for the internal obliques. And then the upper attachments for the internal obliques are the lower three ribs and the abdominal aponeurosis. So the lower three ribs, so that's 10, 11, and 12. So in through here, these lower three ribs. So it's this, let me get rid of that. So this, where it's white along here, that's tendon of the internal obliques. And then, of course, all of this is tendon of internal obliques, which is the internal obliques tying into that abdominal aponeurosis or rectus sheath, whichever you want to call it. Internal obliques actions. Okay, so it's an abdominal muscle that tells us, so we know that as an abdominal muscle, it does flexion of the trunk, because all of the abdominals, with the exception of transversus abdominis, do flexion of the trunk. We also can tell from its fiber direction here that it does lateral flexion of the trunk, right? With fibers running like this, we could pull up on the ilium, pull up on the pelvis, and we could elevate the pelvis, or we could pull down on the rib cage and do lateral flexion. So same action, just different moving ends. So flexion, lateral flexion. Well, if it does flexion, it also does a posterior pelvic tilt, right? So flexion is pulling down on this part. Posterior pelvic tilt is pulling up on this part, okay? But then it does a rotation also. So what the internal obliques do is they pull on the abdominal aponeurosis and pull down toward their attachments here, like that. So they do an ipsilateral rotation, okay? So what that means is, so what I have shown here is the left internal obliques doing an ipsilateral rotation, so they're rotating the body to the left. Now, if we recall, the external obliques go the other way, which of course is hard to tell because of the darn fiber direction on here, but fibers like this. So they're going to do a contralateral rotation because they're going to pull down on the ribs and turn the body to face the opposite way. So the internal and external obliques on the same side of the body, so here are the external obliques, here are the internal obliques, they do rotation in the opposite direction. So on the same side of the body, internal obliques and external obliques are antagonists. On the opposite side of the body, however, so let's look at, let's see, internal obliques, let's do it like this. Fiber direction goes like this. Or actually, let me get rid of that. Let me not do the arrows. Fiber direction like this, okay, for the internal obliques. External obliques, if I were to put on that layer of external obliques, we'd see fiber direction like this. So opposite, right? So, but if we look at it from the front, let's do it like this. Internal obliques, oops, I don't want the arrow. Fiber direction like this on the internal obliques. External obliques, fiber direction like this. Okay, one more time. Let me show it to you a little bit differently. Internal obliques, oh, I am spinning him when I want to draw him. It's a girl, actually. Internal obliques, fiber direction like this. External obliques, fiber direction like this. Well, look at that. On opposite sides, the fiber direction is parallel. See what I'm saying? So the external obliques and the internal obliques on opposite sides of each other are synergistic, which makes sense because the fiber directions are parallel to each other on the opposite side of the body. I hope this makes sense. I can't see your faces, so I don't know if you're puzzled and scratching your head, if you have aha light bulbs going off. But anyway, think about it, work with it, and it'll make sense, I'm sure. So the external obliques on the left do a contralateral rotation, while the internal obliques on the right do an ipsilateral rotation. And so ipsilateral to the right and contralateral to the left are the same direction. Okay? All right, so enough said. Let's go on. What else do we need? So we talked about the internal obliques, we talked about the external obliques. Let's talk about everybody's favorite abdominal muscle, rectus abdominis. So rectus abdominis has the shortest fibers of all of the abdominals, and so it just has these tiny little fibers here, and because it resides inside the rectus sheath, none of its fibers span this whole distance, whereas the other muscles, they do have longer fibers that span a longer distance. But this is going to actually make rectus abdominis a stronger muscle. And so the way that it is set up is it has these shorter fibers, and then where we see the white here and here and here, this is what makes the six-pack. So that where we see the white there is where that rectus sheath is coming together anteriorly and posteriorly. So those connective tissue fibers of the external obliques are interweaving with and joining with those connective tissue fibers of transversus abdominis and all the way through. And so it creates these individual pockets for the fibers of rectus abdominis. So rectus abdominis sounds a lot like erector spinae, right? Except it's on the front. Erector spinae kept the spine erect. Rectus abdominis essentially, so what it means is that it runs straight up and down the spine, but you can kind of think of them as being opposite muscles to the erectors. So the erectors back here going up and down the spine, rectus abdominis here going up and down the spine, but it's from the front. And so they're going to have opposing actions. So rectus abdominis is our strongest of the erectors in this flexion action and posterior pelvic tilt action. And so it has, and those are opposite actions to the erectors, right? The erectors do extension of the spine and an anterior pelvic tilt, whereas rectus abdominis does flexion of the spine and a posterior pelvic tilt. So they are antagonists to each other, but antagonists on opposite sides of the spine, that's sort of handy. That actually helps to keep the spine erect because we have one pulling one direction, the other pulling the other direction. If we get no movement, right, if it's an isometric contraction, then what we are having is the cooperation between antagonistic pairs, and we get posture. All right, so rectus abdominis is not as good at rotation as the internal and external obliques are, because its fiber directions are so up and down. But it can do lateral flexion fairly decently well, especially the more outer aspect of these fibers over here can do lateral flexion. So flexion of the trunk, posterior pelvic tilt, lateral flexion. Not fabulous at doing rotation, but that's okay, because rotation is really covered by the external obliques and the internal obliques. And it does do compression of the abdomen. So if all of these guys contract together, where is rectus? Well, let's say this. What if all of the fibers of rectus abdominis relax and lengthen as much as they can? If that happens, we're going to see rectus abdominis kind of going out like that. And so if all of the fibers together contract and neither the rib cage nor the pelvis moves, we're going to get an action like this. That's our compression of the abdomen. So then the fibers then are all lined up the way that you see them. That this is, kind of the shortened version of the fibers right here. So compression of the abdomen, it is good at doing that also. Let's see, anything else? A little interesting side note on all of the erectors, since they come together here in the middle at that linea alba, sometimes during pregnancy they can separate there, because speaking of this happening during pregnancy of course is happening underneath the abdominal muscles. So the abdominal muscles need to be in a very lengthened position to let that happen. And so they're lengthening and lengthening all day long and trying to work from a lengthened position, which is not a strong thing for a muscle to do, which is why later in pregnancy it's really hard to sit up from a lying down position, because the abdominals are so stretched out. But anyway, what can happen is they can separate from their attachment at the linea alba, which it kind of makes them go like this, so it gives you a little more room to let that baby expand into. So that's not so uncommon, and it's not the end of the world. They'll come back together again. Okay, with proper strengthening and whatever. Okay, let's look at our very last abdominal muscle. That's this guy, transversus abdominis. Oh, time out. We didn't talk about attachments of rectus abdominis. Let's look at attachments. What page is this guy on? 366. Attachments for rectus abdominis. It attaches to the pubic bone down here. So we can't really see it with transversus abdominis there, but let's do this. There. Now we can see its attachment down here at the pubic bone. So it attaches here at the pubic bone, and then it attaches up here at the xiphoid process and the cartilage of ribs 5 through 7. So in through here, cartilage of ribs 5 through 7. That's where rectus abdominis attaches. So it's spanning this distance. It's has a long distance to span. So no wonder it really is so smart for it to be made like this, for it to be able to kind of attach to its own tendon all along the way, in essence, so that it's not this real long fibers kind of just flapping in the breeze. All right, those are the attachments of rectus abdominis. Now last one, transversus abdominis. Transversus, let's take off rectus. Now we can see all of transversus abdominis. So where does transversus abdominis attach? It attaches along the inguinal ligament. So right down here, the inguinal ligament, and the iliac crest, so in through here, and the thoracolumbar fascia, which we saw, but I'm going to have to spin them around to show it. So here, the thoracolumbar fascia, and the lower costal cartilages, so in through here. Okay, so what that means is that transversus abdominis attaches all along here, all around there. Transversus abdominis is fibers run in a transverse direction. That's where the name transversus abdominis comes from. And so see how it attaches all around, all around the rib cage, all around to that thoracolumbar fascia, all around the pelvis, and to the inguinal ligament. That's its origin. Its insertion is the linea alba, or we could say the abdominal aponeurosis. The abdominal aponeurosis is the tendon part all in through here that then attaches here to the linea alba, that central part that all of the erectors attach to. So what is the action of transversus abdominis? I already alluded to it when we were talking about rectus abdominis. If the fibers of transversus abdominis completely relax and lengthen as much as possible, they're going to lengthen out like this, and we're going to get this, which imagine like if you take a deep abdominal breath and you let your belly expand as you take a deep breath. That's transversus abdominis and the other abdominal muscles lengthening and allowing the lungs to come down into the space of the abdomen, and so letting the abdominal muscle, the abdominal organs come out into that into the space of the muscles. So this is what would happen, like with a deep breath in, the abdominal muscles, especially transversus abdominis, would relax and lengthen and allow that expansion in the abdomen to happen. And so then, what is the action of transversus abdominis? So if this is that muscle in a relaxed position, its action then is this, which is shortening up all of its fibers. It's pulling toward its center, and so it is compression of the abdomen. So when do we do compression of the abdomen? We do compression of the abdomen if we're doing a strong exhalation, and we're doing compression of the abdomen anytime we're moving something out of the abdominal cavity. So if we're vomiting, if we're having a bowel movement, if we're laughing, right, and there's we're strongly moving air out of the lungs, but anything anything that, and even during childbirth, the abdominal muscles are all helping with compression of the abdomen. So anytime we move something out of the abdominal cavity, whether it's going up or going down, it's compression of the abdomen is happening, and that's what transversus abdominis does. It is the only action that it has. So of the abdominals, it is the strongest at doing that because its fibers are aligned perfectly for doing that, even though all of the abdominals participate in that action. Okay, so that's it for the abdominals. So we talked about transversus abdominis, this one that we can see here. We talked about rectus abdominis that we can see here. We talked about the internal obliques, and then the most superficial, the external obliques, whose fibers are shown in a weird direction on the app. Okay, so that's it for the abdominals. That's it for video 17. Next up is video 18, where we're going to talk about breathing muscles. So we were just talking about breathing muscles a little bit, right? Because we talked about compression of the abdomen is something that we do for forced exhalation. So we're going to talk about how do we get inhalation to happen, and what's our primary breathing muscle, and what secondary breathing muscles we have as well. All right, that's it for video 17. See you next time around.